Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm R.O.C. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has repeatedly said that Taiwan should pay a protection fee and boost its national defense budget to 10% of its GDP. A recent Reuters report that suggests that Taiwan could meet Trump's demand for a protection fee through a new large-scale arms purchase plan. This would in turn demonstrate that Taiwan takes its self-defense seriously. But could this really be the case? Joining us today are Vincent Chao, Taipei City Councilor, and Wang Kai-chun, Stephen, Foreign Policy Advisor at the Office of R.O.C. Legislator Chiao-hsin. A very warm welcome to both on the show. First, let's take a look at Taiwan's national defense budget. The recently passed central government budget plan showed a total defense budget of US $20 billion, approximately 2.45% of Taiwan's GDP. This is a record high for the country. So let's do the math. Trump has called for Taiwan to increase its national defense budget to 10% of GDP. Taiwan's GDP is roughly US $750 billion, so 10% would be $75 billion. In contrast, the total government budget currently stalled for approval in the national legislature is only US $103 billion. So what exactly would be a US $75 billion defense budget entail? How much pressure could this put on Taiwan? The first question goes to Vincent.
Well, I think to start, I think we're taking hyperbole a little too seriously. I think President Trump has been very consistent in what he expects from partners and allies, which is that each country pay its fair share for defense and, have its own commitment to its own self-defense. And I think these sentiments are absolutely right in terms of Taiwan. And this is absolutely consistent with what the Taiwanese government has been engaged on over the past 8 years. You're absolutely right, number one, to point out that defense budgets have increased tremendously. We've seen the defense budget go up since 2016 by about 80%. We've reached $20 billion US for the first time. We have additional spending going through special budgets, inclusive of naval strike missiles, inclusive of the F-16Vs, and potentially submarines in the future as well. So absolutely, we're doing a lot more in terms of resourcing our defense requirements. A second part of that is conscription. We've reintroduced one-year conscription after a hiatus of about a decade. We're engaged in the purchase, procurement, and use of new high-tech weaponry, particularly asymmetric capabilities that are able to take advantage of Taiwan's geographical strengths and utilize Taiwan's geographical advantages. So all taken together, I think we're embarking on the right direction. I think certainly we're a lot more serious about defense today than we were just a few years ago. And I think when President Trump says that he wants countries to pay more for defense, he means that every country ultimately should not just sit idly by and wait for the United States to support us, and that there's a real commitment that has to be made first in terms of a determination to defend ourselves. And I think that's where President Trump's comments lay, and that's, I guess, the lesson we should take from it.
Right. Stephen, do you agree with Vincent's comment that Taiwan should do its part in this regard?
Well, certainly, I think the defense budget, there is a consensus, I would say, that the defense budget has to increase gradually. But, again, that's kind of entertaining what a 5% and the 10% scenario is going to look like. Let's do the math, right? For example, a 5% GDP share of defense budget is going to equate to, if we look at the current total government budget, we're talking about 43% of the central government spending. 10%, if we double that figure, you got to get around 84% of the central government's annual budget. So, but, as in the legislative event right now, we are very fortunate that the budget is moving forward. A lot of the central budget, the different components of those budgets are now being sent to different individual committees right now. So we're dealing with the reviews of the budget right now. So as of 2025, government, basically, we currently accumulated around 6.8 trillion Taiwanese dollars of debts. That constitutes about 28.6%. According to, for example, what our Public Debt Act and also the Fiscal Discipline Act that currently demand our government to kind of keep the debt down to, for example, 40.6%, something like that. So we still got some space. If the government decide to take the route to kind of borrow more money in terms of spending, for example. So I think there is a tremendous effort that the executive yuan has to do. If those kind of scenario happens, right, 5% or 10%, that they need to communicate not only with the public, but also with the LY to see how we can make this a feasible thing.
That 5% or 10%, in your perspective, could exclude other spending on, for example, warfare. Because Taiwan has become an aging society. On the other hand, of low fertility rates, problems kind of severe. So, Stephen, I still would like to hear more about your comments on this kind of exclusion effect if this take into account the 5% or 10%.
That's a fantastic question. Absolutely. If we do not increase the total share of, for example, the annual central government spending, not only that our constitution actually requires a certain percentages of our central government budget to be put into science, research, and education. At the same time, you're talking about the premier has this plan of devoting 900 billion Taiwanese dollars into a green energy zero emission target with the spending set in 2030. So there is tremendous work for the EY if they want to, for example, avoid crowding out other ministries. How do you basically convince other ministries, convince the people who are currently taking these welfares to put that share into defense?
Vincent, so what's the same question for you? What about, if we all invest, the national budget in military spending, other needs, what about them?
Well, a couple things, right? Again, I have to reemphasize that I think we're taking hyperbole a little too seriously in terms of exact percentages and attributing figure amounts to what I think Trump's general sentiments are, which is that you do need to pay more and do more for your own self-defense. Okay, that's number one. Second one is that it's true that Taiwan has a relatively small central government budget compared to other advanced economies. I mean, our central government budget, as my friend rightly pointed out, it's enormously small in terms of the defense spending that Taiwan's defense requirements may need. As a result, I do think there is limited room for maneuver when you're talking about figures like 5 or 10%. I think a much more realistic first step right now is to get to 3%. And 3%, I think, is an important benchmark because it's a percentage that essentially all the major parties have at one point in time agreed on. So last year during our presidential campaign, I think we were very pleased to see the top three candidates, I mean, DPP's President Lai Ching-te, Hou You-yi from the KMT and Ko Wen-je from the TPP essentially all agreed publicly that they would support 3% of spending on defense. And I think to get there is a very good first step. And then I think after that benchmark, I think it is another good time to reassess sort of how defense budgets could evolve based on our defense requirements and the capabilities we want to field.
If 3% is the goal in your perspective, could you help us to assess the difficulties in increasing that to 3% of the GDP?
I think one of the issues is that every government ministry, if all of a sudden you gave them another $2-3 billion US, I mean, other than DOD, I think would have a hard time thinking organically what that dollar amount would be spent on. In our system, at year end, every agency, their effectiveness will be based on how much money they're able to process and spend every year. And all of a sudden, if there's a pot of gold out there, then you're going to need certain benchmarks. You're going to need certain requirements. You're going to need certain capabilities that you want to field in response to that. So I think an organic-driven defense budget increase will take time. I think much more in terms of what we can do in the short term would be on the procurement front. Whether we're talking about domestic procurement or foreign procurement. And this would be inclusive of, for example, the new asymmetric capabilities that we've been talking about for a long time. Like number one, how do we increase the production and purchase of anti-ship missiles? Number two, how do we engage in the research, development, and production of smart sea mines? What we do on drones. I mean, drones, we're buying MQ-9 Reapers from abroad, we're buying Switchblade drones, but we also have a domestic drone manufacturing industry led by INDSR as well. Sorry, not INDSR, NCIST as well. So of all of these, I think there are a lot of capabilities we should think about now in terms of how we could rapidly scale up purchasing, and that I think would be beneficial as we think about increasing the defense budget.
Stephen, how do the opposition parties perceive this increase? What is KMT most likely to be concerned about? How should Taiwanese people understand the move to boost the national defense budgets from the opposition party's perspective?
I think, first of all, from my personal view, I think that, number one, the KMT doesn't oppose a reasonable increase of defense budget. And I think, secondly, even though we do have a bipartisan consensus that, yes, the direction of increasing defense budget is something that we need to head towards. But we do different in terms of when it comes to what kind of priority we should be setting. For example, one of the things that the KMT during the presidential campaign, even until now, one of the things that we care the most is the retention rate of the soldiers. Because if you don't solve that problem, for example, if you do not increase the benefits of the soldiers, increase the net salaries of the soldiers, one of many perhaps scenario that we're trying to avoid is even, for example, in an alternative universe, all the US weapons and articles arrive in Taiwan on time. We don't have the manpower to man them, to put them into use, to put them into battle orders. So eventually they will become stockpiled. And those were not the major purposes when those weapons come in, right? They cannot form effective deterrents. So I think one of the directions the KMT will be focusing on is, number one, how do you incentivize people to join the military? How do you make sure their training qualities are good? How do you make sure that you can retain those soldiers after their contract has finished?
I personally was in the Army for about 2 years, so I knew what the culture was about. But I heard your question. I think that makes sense. But what's the possible solution, from the KMT perspective, to those, kind of increase the retention rates?
So I think number one, the most important thing is absolutely an increase in terms of their net salaries, for example. A lot of times, if you do the math, right, soldiers, their occupation is very unique compared to all the other occupations and jobs in the society, right? They're required to stand by 24 hours, theoretically, right? When there's emergency situations, where there's mass disaster events, or they need to be regularly called up to trainings and everything. They don't have time to spend with their families, right? They don't have time to perhaps develop their own skills, because everybody, due to the lack of personnel, have to take on responsibilities that perhaps when they sign a contract, that wasn't intended for them. So I think one of the things that we need to mitigate, or at least trying to reduce that sort of unsatisfactory sentiment, is absolutely, number one, you're gonna increase the salary. Number two, you probably need to restore some of the unique benefits that soldiers have. For example, if we go to American airports, right, the VIPs, the first class, and the veterans, and the service members, they get to be, go into the airplane before other passengers, for example. Can we get discounts for them in public transportation? Can we get discounts for them when it comes to other sorts of benefits that they currently do not have, that other, for example, US military personnel have?
Vincent?
Well, just to say, I absolutely agree. I think it's an important part of increasing your defense readiness, the retention rate, recruitment rate. And I think some of the things that are brought up are good ideas, and some of the things that I think are already in motion. For example, this idea that we want to make our armed personnel proud when they wear their military uniforms, when they go out into society, when they, we want to make sure that they feel pride in their job, and that society feels proud that they're willing to sacrifice themselves for our democracy. And so with all of that saying, one of the things that President Tsai Ing-wen worked on since 2016 was this Junrenjie, was our Armed Services Day, and incentivizing soldiers to wear their uniforms in public so that they could go to McDonald's, go to restaurants, go to shopping malls, go to movie theaters, and have discounts and have people acknowledge their service to our country. So I think all of the things that were pointed out are very relevant in terms of how the steps we must take to increase our defense readiness.
Well, I guess that also has to do with our culture, because in the Confucius culture, like the serving in the military is the last priority. So I think that, needs to deal with some kind of fundamental structure out there. Okay, Vincent, I have another question for you. In the face of the Chinese Communist Party's threats to Taiwan, if Taiwan is unable to raise its defense budget to meet Trump's call for 10% of GDP, or advise 5% of GDP by Trump's former National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, what other methods, in your perspective, can Taiwan use to demonstrate its self-defense resolution to the US and other international partners and allies?
Well, number one, we have to be absolutely serious about our own defense, in the sense that we need to be serious in terms of the capabilities we wish to procure. We need to be serious about things like our recruitment and retention rate. We need to be serious about our defense strategies. There's a whole slew of programs that, because of past issues, have atrophied in the face of a lack of focus on defense. And we need to rectify that year by year. And I think we're on the right path. I think for the past 8 years, we've seen a lot more resources go in. We've seen new defense strategies. We've seen acknowledgement that, look, we're not going to be able to fight the PRC tank on tank, plane on plane, destroyer against destroyer, frigate against frigate. It's just not going to happen. How can we be smart about it? And so I think, for example, the $2 billion purchase of CDCMs, Harpoons, are a great, excellent example of that. We've doubled the production rate of our Xiongfeng anti-ship missiles. We're fielding more drones than ever before. And in fact, many of our frontline personnel are being taught in how to actually field and utilize drones, I mean, based on some of the successes we've seen in Ukraine. I mean, we're training our conscripts in terms of how to use stingers and javelins. I mean, all of these are steps in the right direction and go beyond this idea of 5% or 10% of GDP. And I think, again, when we think about these numbers, we're still taking it too literally in the sense that I personally tend to think that defense budget should be capability-based rather than number-based. I mean, if we're stuck on, for example, spending limit, well, how do we get to, let's say, 3%, 4%, 5%? You know, we may just end up deciding to throw money and put money in things we don't necessarily need. So I think defense numbers should be based on capabilities. What are the capabilities we need? How much money we need to put in our defense ministry to ensure that these capabilities are met, and how do we field them effectively? And I think ultimately that's where partners and allies, that's what our partners and allies are going to look at.
Okay, many experts are also concerned about the types of weapons the Trump administration may sell to Taiwan and whether they would meet Taiwan's needs. Let's take a look at the amount of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan during the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. During Trump's 4 years as president, arms sales to Taiwan reached U.S. $18.3 billion, far exceeding the U.S. $14 billion during Obama's 8-year term and U.S. $7.6 billion under the Biden administration. Trump sold to Taiwan large-scale military products from the F-16V HIMARS rocket launcher system to M1N2 tanks and more. Biden's sales focuses on ammunition systems and training. Although the amount of arms sales is smaller under Biden, he also provided Taiwan with US $20.7 billion in military aid. So how would you analyze the relationship between Taiwan and US based on the arms sales figures of successive US presidents? Do you see any difference between Trump and Biden when it comes to Taiwan? Stephen?
Absolutely. I mean, the major differences is about the makeup and the ratio of what we conventionally know as symmetric and asymmetric capabilities, right? So when it comes to President-elect Trump, his first term sold to the R.O.C. includes, like Vincent has mentioned, MQ-9B, HIMARS, Abrams, Harpoons, and also F-16Vs. But when it comes to Biden administration, I think one of the perhaps some notable larger weapon article, but eventually it didn't happen, is the M109A6 Paladin self-propelled guns. Howitzer, sorry. So, and the rest of it, precisely like you mentioned, is overlapping, right? All the other radars, ammunition systems, and all that. So, judging by historical records, but again, you know, a second Trump administration, maybe the president-elect has different ideas, but we can at least see that Trump has more willingness when it comes to compared to President Biden to offer Taiwan heavier equipments, right? So I think it is up to the job of the government right now, the Taiwanese government, to kind of communicate effectively with Washington and says, you know, what is our reasonable speculated or informed speculation in terms of what are the healthy so-called symmetric asymmetric ratio that Taiwan needs to simultaneously deal with the D-Day scenario, also the daily gray zone threats that the PLA, the CCP is imposing on Taiwan. So it's a difficult task ahead.
Vincent, any differences between Trump and Biden in this regard?
I think arms sales, what you'll see is an ebb and flow. So for example, President Trump sold us during his first term $8 billion in terms of 66 F-16Vs. I mean, we've wanted new F-16Vs for decades. The last F-16 purchase was made during the George W. Bush administration in the 1990s. And so certainly I mean, we have to look at it in the sense that there are certain priorities that we've had, and we've had a lot of these priorities, I think, fulfilled during the Trump administration. As a result, I think the priority has turned more to the munitions, to the service component, to the asymmetric component, and so forth. And so I think what you'll see is that there may be a return back again to larger scale arms sales going forward. But I think more than anything, that's just part of the normal ebb and flow of arms sales rather than a purposeful tactic to say, hey, from Biden, we're not going to sell anything expensive, and from Trump, we're not going to sell anything cheap. I don't think that's the case at all. But I will say this, these are my personal thoughts, but I do think that our military needs to be a lot more smarter in terms of the weapons requests that they raise. I think a lot of the weapons requests that we've seen out there quoted in the media would suggest to many friends in the United States that we just aren't serious enough about our own defense, and we aren't serious enough about putting dollars where it counts. So some of these capabilities, for example, while they may have enormous peacetime use, I think would have far, far more limited utility in either contingency or a gray zone scenario. And so I do think that as we look at potential arms sales lists going forward, and we will, I mean, arms sales have been part and parcel of the Taiwan-U.S. relationship for the past 4 or 5 decades. And so I think we will need to take a second look at the capabilities and the equipment that would most make sense from preventing sort of the worst case scenario that we all talk about all the time, and at the same time that the CCP seems to be preparing for.
Okay, also my follow-up for you, Vincent, is that what was key to the past Trump administration's arms sale to Taiwan in reaching US $18.3 billion? Trump was willing to sell Taiwan large-scale arms in his first administration. Will this also be the case in his second term? What strategy should Taiwan take? What is critical for Taiwan to effectively negotiate with Trump?
So most of the large arms, the figure is mostly based on the big F-16V buy, so that's about $8 billion. We've had another $5 billion special budget targeting, for example, CDCM, other naval assets as well. So that together is about $13 billion, and we had some other smaller packages come out as well. I think the key part, again, is that the figure is great. I mean, it's great as a symbol of commitment in the Taiwan-U.S. relationship. It's great that the U.S. is willing to break past, I think, restrictions in selling us useful and capable equipment. But it's also great that sort of we're giving money and buying our own weaponry as opposed to asking for handouts, as many countries, other countries in the world tend to do. So I think it's good. It's a healthy relationship. But at the same time, I would argue against focusing too much on dollar figures. Like, is getting $30 billion, $40 billion, $50 billion as important as getting the right capability so that we can defend ourselves? And so I think focusing too much on the dollar figures tends to inflate the military budget in ways that may not necessarily be conducive to Taiwan's defense. And I think what we should be focused on is having rational, sober discussions with our friends in the United States in terms of plugging up the gaps in our capabilities, whether we're talking about D-Day scenarios or gray zone tactics, as Stephen had mentioned.
Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I work in the Legislative Yuan, and I'm currently in the Defense Committee. So we have to look at the defense numbers, right? In terms of the capabilities that we can get, I think the reason perhaps that the first Trump administration is so keen on selling us a lot of things that the previous administrations were not being able to do is, I think one of a simpler logic to kind of explain that is, he has this very commercial and transactional attitude, right? If American firms can make money and Taiwan is willing to pay for that money, then why not? Go ahead. And also you have, for example, the last 2 years of the first term of Trump, he wasn't really having a good relationship with the PRC, for example. So I think when it comes to the future, right, I think I personally think we should first kind of exactly understand what we need, exactly understand what is our defensive doctrine, what is the sort of capabilities that I think, that we need to prepare, for the two scenarios, right? And again, what are our priorities? Is it focusing on getting more weapons, or is it focusing on retention and also higher qualities of training, so.
Okay, Taiwan has previously expressed to the U.S. its interest in acquiring F-35s. However, the U.S. responded by saying that it believes upgrading the F-16 is more in line with Taiwan's current defense needs. The Aegis-class destroyers are also not on the list of sales to Taiwan. What are U.S. considerations behind this choice? At present, what kind of arms sales does Taiwan most urgently need? Vincent?
I think there is no serious military planner that envisions, I think, a comprehensive role for either F-35s or any of our other fighter jets if a contingency scenario were to break out. I mean, these have enormous peacetime uses. They're useful in defending ourselves against gray zone tactics, and certainly they're symbolic of the commitment that the U.S. has for Taiwan's defense, self-defense. But I think the key issue is that if we have a big buy of F-35s, I mean, and we put in a lot of money for their maintenance, for their training and all of that, what is the use in a contingency scenario when we will have very limited use of runways, when we have very limited ways to resupply and to restock our ammunitions and to reload them onto our F-35s. I mean, these are all these scenarios that must be played out comprehensively.
Stephen, do you think that Taiwan really needs F-35 even S for protecting Taiwan?
So I think what Vincent had talked about is certainly a very convincing argument, and to a large extent, I'd agree. We have to be quite realistic. But that also kind of reflected some of the mentalities perhaps in the service members in the Taiwanese military, right? For example, F-35 had this very unique, I would say, vertical takeoff capabilities. So that kind of makes the Air Force a little bit interested in terms of what these capabilities can do when it comes to the survivability of its capability, right? When it comes to the actual invasion scenarios. But yes, F-35, there is a major political and also perhaps fiscal hurdle when it comes to Taiwan trying to acquire all these weapons. But when it comes to the Aegis systems, it is incredibly vital because it does provide early warning capabilities for Taiwan. And currently the only type of naval vessel we have in our Navy that has similar capabilities like air defense, and also radar detection systems, situational awareness is the Keelung class. For the American audience, it's the Kit class. But all of our service vessels right now are getting old, and we're not getting a sufficient amount of replenishments on those things.
Okay, Stephen and Vincent, thank you for your great insights in the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. If you like our show, please hit the subscribe button or give us a thumbs up on our YouTube channel. Stay safe and see you soon.